Good afternoon, everyone. So glad that you have joined us today. As you know, last week was Veterans Day. I want to invite you, if you are a veteran, would you stand? Here at Valley Assembly, we honor our veterans, and we are so glad to have our veterans join us today. My name is Pastor Kent. I'm the lead pastor here at Valley, and it's part of this past year. One of the things that has been so apparent to me, and I should say past 2 years now, one of the things that has become so apparent to me is that when we easily give up our freedom, it is a major slap in the face to those who have been willing to give their lives and for those who have given their lives for our freedom. In so many cases, and in some quite innocently, not knowing really because we haven't navigated a season like this in our lifetimes at least. But I believe that we have been given as Christians stewardship of the country that God's given us. And for all of us, whether we're Christians or not, if we're Americans, we've been given stewardship of the freedom that God has given us. One of the things that we need to understand is what our rights genuinely look like, because we're not being told that from the mainstream media. And today we have invited KrisAnne Hall and her husband JC to join us. I'd like to introduce to you Tim Alt, who will be our MC this afternoon. And again, I just want to say thank you so much for being here today, and pray that you will have a wonderful time learning, getting to develop some relationships. And if you're joining us online, welcome, and we're glad to have you a part of this as well.
All right, let's stand and let's open with the Pledge of Allegiance. I pledge allegiance
to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all.
Father, we're so thankful that we can gather together in freedom. God, we pray today will be profitable, not only for ourselves, for our county, for our state, for federal, but for your kingdom. Lord, we're so thankful that we can just put our trust in you, that no matter what man does, no matter what man says, you are the one that is in control. And today we are just so thankful that we can learn of your principles, the freedoms that we have, because we know they come from you. We pray that today will be profitable. We pray this in Jesus' name. Amen. Amen. You may be seated. Elaine is going to lead us in the national anthem.
Would you stand?
Sorry about that.
Just sing with me. Oh, say, can you see by the dawn's early light what so proudly we hail at the twilight's last gleaming, whose broad stripes and bright stars through the perilous fight o'er the ramparts we watched were so gallantly streaming, and the rockets red glare, the bombs bursting in air gave proof through the night that our flag was still there. Oh, say does that star-spangled banner
KrisAnne Hall with us here today, along with her husband, JC. And I know you're going to enjoy these sessions very much. At the end of the sessions, at the end of the day, we are going to take up a love offering for them. They don't charge for these gatherings. They just make their living off of their products and so forth. So we invite you to go to their table afterwards during the intermissions and make yourself available for that. So the love offering at the back of the auditorium is drop boxes. And so we wanted to give you time to prepare and that type of thing, so you can just drop your love offering in the drop box. I'm going to read KrisAnne's, in introducing her, I'm going to read her bio, and it is quite thorough. And she has phenomenal accomplishments throughout her life and also what she's doing currently. But KrisAnne Hall received her bachelor's degree in biochemistry from Blackburn College and her Juris Doctor from the University of Florida College of Law. She served in the U.S. Army as a military intelligence cryptologic linguist and was a prosecutor for the state of Florida for nearly a decade. KrisAnne also worked with a prominent national First Amendment law firm where she traveled the country defending Americans whose rights were violated by unlawful arrest and prosecutions. KrisAnne is the most sought-after national speaker on the Constitution, averaging over 250 events in nearly 22 states every year for 5 years straight. Man. Makes you kind of feel like you haven't done anything. She has written 6 books on American history and the U.S. Constitution and is now a professor at River University School of Government. KrisAnne is a regular consultant on the Constitution for numerous radio, podcast, and television programs. She has been seen on I-24 News, Law and Crime, Newsmax, Fox News, and she has been interviewed by C-SPAN in depth. And her books and classes have been featured on C-SPAN Book TV. I'll continue. KrisAnne has had a national popular radio show for over 6 years that is carried both on terrestrial and internet stations. KrisAnne lives in Tampa, Florida with her husband JC Hall and their son Colton. She can be found at KrisAnneHall.com. So with that, we'll just invite KrisAnne to the stage and let's give her a really warm welcome.
Thank you. You guys are so awesome. Am I on? Thank you. That was an amazing, thank you so much for that kind and generous introduction. I'm so excited to be in the great state of Washington. Okay, don't laugh. I actually believe that Washington is awesome. And the people of Washington are awesome. And I mean that. I truly, truly mean that. So many times you see places and we travel around and I've even heard speakers stand up on the stage and say, patriots in California and Washington and Oregon, you need to leave your states right now and head out to a freedom-loving state. No, you don't. You need to stay here and stand up and defend the ground you stand on. We are God's people. We have a gift of liberty from God. We have a charge from God. We don't surrender. We don't retreat. He has given us the ground beneath our feet, and we have a call and a responsibility and a duty to secure what's been given to us for future generations. So do not give up. Do not retreat. Take what is yours and keep what has been given. I rebuke anybody who says you need to quit. Because I'm going to tell you, number one, some of the most passionate, most ardent patriots in the country are right here. Right here. Because you look throughout history, and I'm an historian, you look throughout history, the greatest awakenings only come from the greatest oppressions. Because only then do you realize you have something to fight for. And you have something to fight for. What was it that David said? Do we not have a cause? Do we not have a cause? You have a cause, Washington. You have a cause, and we're here to stand with you. Samuel Adams said this: "No people will tamely surrender their liberties nor be easily subdued when knowledge is diffused and virtue is preserved." He said, on the contrary, when the people become universally ignorant and debauched in their manners, they will sink underneath their own weight without the aid of foreign invaders. I mean, is that not become an evident truth to us today? I mean, if we are honest, we have lost more liberty at our own hands in the last 2 years than we have in the last 100 years from any foreign influence. But Sam tells us what the disease is. The disease is ignorance, which brings about the most destructive symptom: a lack of courage. That's the virtue he's talking about, is courage. See, we don't have an economic crisis in America. We don't have a health crisis in America. We do not even have a supply chain crisis in America. We have a courage crisis in America. And if we're honest, we've been trained to be that way. Multiple decades of people being raised in an educational system that has taught them the wrong things about the proper role of government, the proper power of government, and the proper power of the people over government. And that's what we're here to help today. So my little legal disclaimer, if you'll allow me, I'm not here to teach you everything you need to know about the Constitution of the United States and the Constitution of the State of Washington. That's not possible in 3 sessions. But what we're here to do is give you the most basic foundation for you to establish a stable foothold to build upon, to assure liberty for your future. Because that's really the goal here, for our future. What we do today, make no mistake, what we do today has eternal impact. The choices we make today are not for ourselves. Samuel Adams also said, when we tamely suffer a lawless attack upon our liberty, we encourage it. When we go along to get along, when we comply to maintain our comfort, we actually encourage the tyrant's hand. But Adams continues and says, that is a circumstance that should weigh heavy upon our hearts. That ages and millions yet unborn will be the miserable sharers of this experience. Do we remain pacified in prosperity? Do we remain lazy in our luxury? Do we cling to our comforts? Or do we say, you know what? We've let a lot of stuff slip by that should not have slipped by. We have tolerated government that we should have nipped in the bud a long time ago. But everybody has to come to the point in time where they say, nah, no more. I'm not going to do it anymore. That's it. And then you make that step. That corrective behavior. But you see, if we are not grounded in truth, wisdom, and knowledge, notice I didn't say education, because we ought to be abundantly aware that we've been plagued with bad education. But we need to be grounded in truth and wisdom so we don't become our own worst enemy. That we don't go chasing after what we think is right and achieving it in the wrong ways, bringing about disastrous results. Because that's actually been what we've been doing. And what I want to do today, what JC and I are going to do today, is set a course-correcting foundation. And I'm going to start off by asking you to do a couple things for today's training. We're going to start off with a pop quiz. He told you I was a professor. You should have expecting this, right? A pop quiz. The rules, the conditions of the pop quiz are this. You cannot look for the answer in your pocket constitution. No, you're not allowed to search for the answer on your phone or your tablet. You're not allowed to call a friend. No lifelines available. And if you think you know the answer, no shouting out the answer. I don't even want you to lip sync the answer, because I don't want your neighbor cheating off of you. Everybody agree? We got a pretty healthy group of libertarians in the household, don't we? Those are the ones that she wants me to raise my hand. I'm not raising my hand. I'm not doing anything unless somebody that want to do it. You go, libertarians. You go. So you guys agree to the terms? Yeah. Here we go. Pop quiz. There are 5 liberties identified in the First Amendment. To yourself and not out loud, name all 5 liberties of the First Amendment. Now, you were told I have been doing this for 11 years now. I lost track 7, 8 years now. I averaged 260 meetings in over 22 states before the lockdowns. I have asked this question everywhere I've gone. You know, since I started asking this question in 2010, certain media outlets and pollsters have picked up this question and asked it, in national polls. And they have discovered what I know to be true from my own personal experience. In any given group of people, at best, 2% of the people in that audience can name all 5 liberties of the First Amendment. 2% can name all 5. If you don't know what your rights are, how do you know they're not already gone? How can you defend what you cannot define? How are you going to secure for our future an essential liberty you can't put your hands on? How are you going to elect someone who takes an oath to support and defend those rights if you can't vet them to see if they even know what those rights are they're supposed to support and defend? Because we are not a kingdom, nor are we a democracy where power comes from the top down. We are a constitutional republic where all government derives from the consent of the governed. There is no power in government that does not originate from the individual. Translation, government has no authority to do what I cannot lawfully do on my own. Why do we have rogue governments? Because the people have lost touch with the basic fundamentals of who America is. So, our first session today, how did we get to where we are? I mean, I don't know how many of you are Constitution wonks or historical nerds like I am, but have you ever wondered, why aren't we the kingdom of America? I mean, what happened? Anybody here remember from their history class that there were people begging George Washington to be king? I mean, just that knowledge should tell us how close we were to being the kingdom of America. So what happened? See, that knowledge of what happened is essential to understanding why we are what we are and how we maintain what we were given. You see, Patrick Henry says this: I have but one lamp by which my feet are guided, and that is the lamp of experience. I know no way to judge the future but by the past. Alexander Hamilton said, experience is the oracle of truth, and where its responses are unequivocal, they ought to be held to be sacred and conclusive. Einstein said it a little bit differently. If you do the same thing over and over again, expecting different results, that's the very definition of insanity. But all of those decisions hinge on the wisdom and knowledge of the past. Because as Jefferson would classify it, there are certain unequivocal truths, self-evident truths about who we are as a people, human nature. How do we study history to improve our future? Well, first you have to understand that human nature dictates our activity, and human nature never changes. How many of you know a guy named Solomon? Yeah? Right? You don't actually know him. All right, nobody that old out here, right? Solomon said, there is nothing new under the sun. Why? Because human nature never changes. Let's do a survey here. Let's see how many honest people we have in the audience. Raise your hand if you're willing to admit that you have made the same stupid mistake more than once in your life. right? Keep your hands up. Everybody look around. Wow. Do you understand? This is your community built of people who make the same stupid mistakes more than once. But that's history. You know, we have this saying, those who do not know their history are doomed to repeat it. That's not true. That's only half true. Why? Because human nature never changes. You always repeat history. History, that's what Patrick Henry is telling us. You always repeat history. You can know the future because you're constantly repeating history. Those who do not know their history are doomed to repeat its mistakes. See, when you study history, I hated it, by the way. I think now, knowing how powerful the knowledge of history is, what a gift the knowledge of history actually is, that it's by design we are trained to hate the study of history. Right? Because you go to school and it's always memorize the dates and the dead people. As a kid, how do I relate to numbers and dead people? Then you get like Ferris Bueller's Day Off. Bueller, Bueller, Bueller. When in reality, history is life. It is vibrant. It is not about dead people. It's about living people. It's about how they lived their lives, the good, the bad, the ugly, and what we can take from that to make a better future. I teach this class that I'm about to teach you in grade schools. They love it because it's a history where I talk about kings chopping off heads and brothers killing brothers. And they're like, yeah. I had a middle schooler, I still remember her name, which is a miracle. Just ask my husband. Her name's Whitney, and she came up to me after this history class. She said, I wish I had history teachers like you. How did you become so enthusiastic? I think the word she used was passionate about this. I said, number one, I believe what I'm teaching you. And number two, I love the people I'm teaching you about. And number three, I believe I'm in a public school. And she asked me, so I can answer. I believe that liberty is a gift from God, and the same God that gave me life gave me a responsibility to be passionate about that liberty so you can be free. That's what we need. We need that passion to be rebirthed in us. So we're do a little activity here, just a little one. And remember the last pop quiz, I didn't want you to shout out loud. This time I want you to shout out loud. Don't be shy. You're not going to get graded. But I'm going to count to 3. And when I get to 3, I want you to shout out the first name that comes to your head regarding the foundation of America. Got it? 1, 2, 3. Did you ever stop to think that no matter who you just shouted out, if you were historically accurate in that, none of those people were Americans? There were no Americans until July 2nd, 1776. Everybody who lived in the American colonies named after the continent, not the Union, were British. Now it is true, even Thomas Paine will tell you in his book, The Rights of Man, that American colonies were a melting pot, people coming from all over. But what you must recognize is once they stepped foot on this soil, they became subjects to British law. Our constitutional republic is an evolution of British law. You cannot know who we are and how our government is supposed to work, the design of our constitutional republic, without knowing the history of British constitutional law. And I don't mean constitutional law in the way we teach today in law school, because law schools don't teach the Constitution anymore. As a matter of fact, the law schools started to stop teaching the Constitution in 1833. Our law schools teach modern version of constitutional law, which teaches that judges and lawyers know more about the Constitution than the men who wrote it. Therefore, it means whatever we want it to mean, or whatever they want it to mean, to fit their needs. Transforming our Constitution from a standard to toilet paper. Really, it doesn't mean anything at all unless I want to put it to use. So that's what we're going to do today. We're going to learn, number one, history always repeats. Number two, those who do not know their history are doomed to repeat its mistakes. Number three, why aren't we the kingdom of America? And number four, what do we need to know to move forward? All in this segment. So a little backdrop of history, just like through 400 years. What we have is an island where a group of people have immigrated from Denmark to start a new life, the southern part of this island. And for 400 years, roughly, they've been ruled by Danish kings, every once in a while a French king, every once in a while Nordic something or another. But we're going to come forward to the year 1014. And in this snapshot that begins our historical lesson on the foundation of American Constitution, in 1014, it's not England yet. It's a land where the Anglo-Saxons live. And in this snapshot in 1014, they were recently ruled by the Danish king, but the Danish king has died. And now, after coming to certain very important realizations over 400 years, they've decided they don't want a Danish king anymore. They want to self-govern. Now, one of the realizations that they've come to this conclusion is a very important one for us. I mean, all of history is important, but we're just going to, highlight the big ones. Number one, they figured out when the government that rules is so far away from the people, the rights of the people cannot be secure. Because when the government that rules is detached from its people, the people inevitably, in the eyes of that government, become nothing more than property and chattel to the government. There is a disassociation, a devaluing of the people through that distance. No association. So they do not want a foreign king. And so what's happening, amazingly, is they are governing themselves in their local governments. Now, their local governments are called shires. Right, you've seen The Hobbit, right? Okay. They're called shires. And each shire has its own government. And they're doing amazingly well. Peace, prosperity within their shires and amongst the shires. They're doing so well, they're attracting the attention of foreign kings. Oh, wait. Look at those people. They have great prosperity and peace. But they're missing something. They don't have a king. They must need one. So they're having a problem. How do we keep our prosperity and our peace? And keep the security of our people and their government from the foreign attack? Right, because the year's 1014, and if it's your job to be the sentinel in the tower who is going to be looking and watching for a king's army marching on them, and you just happen to see the king's troops coming, it's 1014. You're not picking up your cell phone and texting the neighboring shire, hey, it's time to organize for our defense. The neighboring shire is probably a good day's horse ride away. So problem number one with the local governments alone is this. Listen very closely, because I want you to pick up these parallels, because history always repeats, and we must learn these lessons. How do we organize, they ask, for our common defense? Does that phrase sound familiar to you? See, one of the things we're going to learn from this first session is there is absolutely nothing new, nothing novel, nothing invented by our founders in our Declaration of Independence, our Constitution, and our Bill of Rights. Absolutely everything within our first three foundational documents are things that we have inherited through experience and understanding of principles. So when I tell you these people were having a hard time figuring out how do we organize for our common defense, that should trigger a catchphrase for you from the preamble of our Constitution. How many of you studied the preamble to the Constitution? How many of you know the preamble to the Constitution because you heard Schoolhouse Rock? Yeah? We the people, in order to form a more perfect union, establish justice and ensure domestic tranquility, provide for the common defense, promote the general welfare, and secure the blessings of liberty to ourselves and our posterity, do ordain and establish this Constitution for the United States of America. Right? The power of a melody. But you catch that? In the very job description, mission statement of our Constitution, right there, planted in the middle, a lesson we learned from 1014. Problem number one, how do we organize for our common defense? Problem number two, if you want to keep peace with a foreign kingdom, the best way to do that is via treaty. Now, you can have a peace treaty, but they're very precarious. The most powerful peacekeeping treaty is actually a trade agreement. Because when a foreign government has an investment in what you guys are going to trade, not only are they not going to attack you, but they might help you if you're being attacked. Here's the problem. In 1014, to create a treaty, you have to have one king sit down with another king and have a conversation. But these people have no king. How many of you think that some foreign king's just going to sit down and have a conversation with any common person? Right? Not going to happen. How do we provide for our common defense? How do we negotiate treaties? Well, people don't know what they don't know. If we could wrap our brains around that truth, we'd be a lot better off. We don't know what we don't know. And they fall back on what they know. Okay, so I guess we have to have a king. But let's do something a little bit different. First off, remember, we're not going to have a foreign king. So we're going to go to this guy named Ethelred. And we're going to say to Ethelred, we allow you to be our king because you are us. You share our culture, you share our land, you share our principles. We will allow you to be our king on one condition. Your only job is to help us organize for our common defense and to create treaties for our foreign affairs. You will leave us alone to continue to govern ourselves. And I have just taught you the foundation of our constitutional republic. That is upon which every relationship of government exists in America. The federal government's authority is foreign, and they are to leave the states alone to govern themselves. Now, you don't have to take my word for it. I don't know which name you shouted out. Anybody out there shout the name James Madison? James Madison is referred to as the father of our Constitution. He writes a document we call Federalist 45, in which he says, the powers delegated by the proposed Constitution to the federal government are few and defined. He didn't just say few, he said defined. He says those that remain in the state governments are numerous and indefinite. The powers delegated to the federal government, he says, will be exercised principally upon external objects, foreign affairs. And then he names them: war, peace, negotiation, foreign commerce. He goes on to say the powers that are reserved to the states will be exercised on all the objects which involve the ordinary course of affairs, to include the lives, the liberties, the properties of the people, the internal order, improvement, and prosperity of the state. James Madison did not wake up with a divine epiphany. He studied his history. And they learned the lessons of the past to create a better future. That if you want to have liberty, your government has to be limited and defined. So we have a new kind of kingdom birthed here in 1014. One where the government, by the will of the people, the government's power is limited and defined. And you have a separation of powers between the local and foreign. It's called a limited monarchy. This is the beginning of who we are. So now let's move forward about 30 years. This is the king. It is now England, by the way. Little historical trivia for you. How do you get the word England? Well, it's the land upon which the Anglos lived. And when you say Angleland really quick with an English accent, it begins to sound like England. Angleland becomes England. And so now, Edward the Confessor is the king of England. And the people love Edward because they say he is a generous king. Now let's review really quickly. Under the Ethelred agreement, does the king have the authority to be generous to the people? No. Why? Because the king's authority is foreign, not domestic. In order to be generous to the people, you have to expand the king's authority beyond the agreement to be able to reach the people. In less than 30 years, the people have expanded the power of the king beyond the original verbal agreement to reach the people based on one element of human nature. People like free stuff. Yeah, if you want to get biblical about it, it's just our human nature of covetousness. And because people like free stuff, human nature says you don't ask where it came from or what it's going to cost you later. So look at what we've done. We have allowed the generosity of those in power increase their power, which requires a submission of the people. You see, because when you get free stuff from the king, you are required to obey his command to keep the free stuff. That's where the increase of power comes from. You'll do what it takes to stay comfortable. Nobody changed the law. Nobody changed the agreement. The people just accepted it because they wanted the stuff. And they began to cling with their comfort more than their liberty. Because at one point they knew that the king had to be limited, and then they forgot because of the shiny things. Well, here's the bad news. Edward the generous king is about to die, and he has no heir to the throne. Now, typically speaking, when a king dies without an heir, you have to go to the next in line to be king to inherit the throne, and that's usually a cousin. And so the cousin who's going to inherit the throne is this guy. His name is William the First. But now we have a problem. Because you see, William is not English. William is a foreign king. He's French. And they still remember they don't want a king far removed from the people. And they figure, well, we don't run by your typical kingdom-style monarchy rule. We are a limited monarchy. And back in 1014, we chose our king. So why not choose our king again? I mean, there's nothing to stop us from doing that. And we don't want William to be our king because he's a French king, and French kings are not limited in their power. French kings are your stereotypical king. I say, you do, or else. Game of Thrones, Reign, every movie you've ever seen about kings. So instead, they choose this guy to be their king, Harold Godwinson. Now, Harold was Edward's best friend, the second wealthiest man in all of England, second only to the king himself. And so they're best friends, and he's got a lot of money. The people are pretty sure Harold's going to be generous too. Because that's really, don't you love it when you're teaching and all of a sudden something just drops in? You see, the only criteria they care about now is, are they going to give a king that gives them stuff? Well, we have a problem. We have a foreign affairs problem now, because William believes he has a birthright to become king. And he's been looking forward to this. And he's not happy that the people are trying to pass him over as king. And this is really bad news for the English people, because William has a nickname. He is called William the Conqueror. Now, what do you suppose happens when you make a guy mad whose nickname is the Conqueror? Yeah. He raises up his Norman army. He goes over and defeats Harold and the English people in a very famous battle called the Battle of Hastings. How many of you learned about the Battle of Hastings? How many of you were taught in your school year textbook the Battle of Hastings is an essential component of American history? Well, it is, because now William is king. Now, here's the reality. William doesn't want to be a limited monarchy king. He wants to be an all-powerful king he believes he deserves to be. He's entitled to be. Now, because we haven't had kings in America, well, not on paper anyway, let me explain to you the power of a king. See, kings are executives with the power to write law. It's called a decree. So William, who doesn't want to be limited under English law, could very well, quite legally, issue a decree that says, I am William the First, I am Norman, I am your king. The land will now be governed by Norman law. He would be within his lawful right, his legal right, rather, to do that. But William either has really good advisors or he's a wise man himself, and he knows that to change the law by just simply a swipe of the pen is a really bad idea when you've had to conquer the people to become king in the first place. Right? Because if you have to conquer the people to become king in the first place, that's a pretty good indication they don't want you. And if you don't want William to be your king in 1066, do you start a recall petition? Do you find a new king to run against him in the next kingly election? No, if you don't like your king in 1066, what do you have to do? Right, you have to raise up a rebellion and chop off his head. Now, crazy thing is, William wants to keep his head and his throne at the same time. So he figures, instead of rewriting the law to change the law, it would be in his best interest to instead fundamentally transform the kingdom in such a way that the people don't notice. And he knows human nature, so he knows the first way to do that. How do you rewrite the law, change the law, without actually rewriting the law? Step number one, you trade out the judges in the legal system, go ahead, with judges that are not loyal to the land, but loyal to the ideology of the king. Because there's something crazy spiritual, Pastor, about judges. I haven't figured it out. It's got to be spiritual. Something about judges, people trust judges. Unquestionably. I mean, think about this. Just think about it. What's your name, ma'am? Kim? All right, we're going to pretend that Kim and I have decided to start a business. And we're going to do it right. We sit down and we create a contract, and within our contract, we describe what Kim's job will be, what my job will be, and what the goal of our business will be. It's a business contract. And by miracle hand of God, in 2 years, we have a multi-billion-dollar business. It's my analogy. I can do that. But because we grew so quickly, we're now in a quandary. How does this contract, which envisioned only a tiny business, now apply to a multi-billion-dollar business? Well, we're not quite sure. So we go down to the local Walmart. And we're sitting in the parking lot, and we're watching the people. And then out of Walmart comes this person, very finely dressed, looks well-educated, very well-kept, stately kind of person. Got the right dress on and everything. And we go up to this person, and I say, hey, nice to meet you. This is my business partner, Kim. We have a multi-billion-dollar business, and we're not quite sure how our contract works. And we thought maybe you should be the one that decides. You're laughing, because that's probably the dumbest thing you've heard, right? But take that same person walking out of Walmart, put a black robe on them, sit them behind a bench. Now all of a sudden, their decisions are ultimate. They are undeniable and unchallengeable because you call them judge. You don't know them any more than the person walking out of Walmart, but because of the way they're dressed and where they're sitting, unquestionable, unchallengeable. It's got to be spiritual. And William knows it. Now, how are you going to quell a rebellion? Well, that's really easy. The first step is to use the judges and the law to bring in foreign law, and you have to attack all the opposition. You use that law to attack those who opposed you in the Battle of Hastings, who continue to pose and speak against you now. And the way you do that, you see, listen, is you chase those who oppose you through the law out of the kingdom. You take the land from the landowners that oppose you, and then sometimes even chase them entirely out of the kingdom. Because if you want to quell your rebellion, you've got to get rid of the opposition. Anybody who disagrees with you, anybody with the courage to challenge you, you have to get rid of them. Now, Norman law has a provision that says, if land in the kingdom becomes abandoned, the ownership of that land reverts back to the king. So William has now effectively chased all the opposition that he can identify out of the kingdom, and he has all this abandoned land. Oh my, look at that abandoned land. What a coincidence. I now own it. What's step number 2 to quelling a rebellion? Reward compliance. So you chase out all the opposition, and then you invite all your friends to come live on the land that you now miraculously own. Anybody that agrees with you, anybody that likes you, anybody that fears you, anybody that wants something from you, you populate the land, and then you reward their compliance. Because land ownership is power in a kingdom. Now, the churches are very powerful in this day as well, and William's not going to let that power slip through his fingers either. He does the same thing in the churches that he did in the courtrooms, by chasing out the leaders of the church and replacing them with men who are not loyal to the word of God, but to the command of the king. Then you actually have so-called leaders pretending to be religious men, teaching their congregations that to disobey the king is to disobey God. So that whatever the king says, whatever the government's command, you must submit or else you dishonor God, even if those commands are contrary to the word of God. Which, whether we realize it or not, actually elevates the king above God himself. You see, when you control the law, when you control the land, when you control the church, you have now transformed society, and the people don't even notice. Now, this transformation is going to take place through a period of about 40 years, through the reign of William I and his son, William II. Now, William II, who is, strangely referred to as William the Red. No, seriously, the kids love this part. Because when his picture comes up, inevitably they go, eh. And then I have to tell them, well, history, those who lived with William, said that William was actually covered from head to toe in this incredibly thick, curly red hair. So much so, they said that if you saw him naked, you would think he was a bear. See, that's how you connect history to the kids. But watch. William's only going to rule for about 13 years. William is described as being a wicked, evil king just like his father. And he will rule in that way until one day when William II and his little brother Henry I go hunting together. You know the history? No, just the human nature. William II is killed in a mysterious hunting accident when a stray arrow from his little brother's hunting party accidentally kills William right in the eye, DOA, coincidentally making Henry king. Now, it is true that they did not like his brother. But you see, they also realized that if Henry will murder his own brother to become king, what will the value of the people's lives be to him? So Henry has to do some things to appease the people so he can keep his throne in his head at the same time. Now, he does a number of things. We don't have time to go into all of them. Many of them are very important. If you take our classes at libertyfirstsociety.com, you can learn a little bit more of the strategies of Henry I. But the most important thing Henry is going to do for our history lesson today, Henry is going to write the first of 5 documents that will become our Declaration of Independence, our Constitution, and our Bill of Rights. Our Declaration of Independence, our Constitution, and our Bill of Rights are the product of 5 written documents, 5 English constitutions that actually make one constitution for the English people. 5 documents over 700 years. Without these 5 documents, we may not have the government that we have today, and if we did, it would look a lot different. The very first of these written documents is called the 1100 Charter of Liberties. The 1100 Charter of Liberties is Henry's promise to the people that the government will never be evil and oppressive again. Skeptics. He makes a list of 14 things that the government's not allowed to do. Because if the government engages in any one of these 14 things, the people are now on notice in writing that they have an evil and oppressive government, and they are righteously justified to resist that government. Now, we're not going to go through all 14. You can, though. It's online. I'm going to share with you one, which is actually the second one on the list. Now remember, the Williams were stealing land from the people. And this whole promise by Henry was simply, I'm not going to be evil and oppressive like my brother, so you don't have to kill me. And this one says, if any of my baron or earl shall die. Now the barons and the earls are the landowners. If any of my baron or earl shall die, his heirs shall not be forced to purchase their inheritance, but shall retrieve it through force of law and custom. Because this king in 1100, with no Google, realized that if the heirs of an estate have to pay the government before they can receive their inheritance, you have an evil and oppressive government. Sound familiar? What do we call that today? Inheritance tax? Death tax? How is it that these people with no internet knew that inheritance tax was the mark of an evil and oppressive government, and yet today we allow our governments to call it revenue? Could it be because we've been teaching the wrong things for a very long time? How different would America be today? How different would Washington be today if we had just taught this history up to this point? Maybe Americans would have come to the realization a long time ago that property ownership in America is merely an illusion. You don't own property. Nobody owns property in America. Even if you have your mortgage paid off, you don't own your property. Test it out. Don't pay your property taxes for 3 years and you'll find out who owns your property. Right? Well, what they'll tell you is, we are seizing possession of your property to pay the debt you owe on your unpaid property taxes. That's a lie, because 3 years of property tax doesn't even come anywhere close to the total value of your land. They are not seizing your property to pay off your tax debt. They are evicting you because you have failed to pay the government rent. When the former president, Barack Obama, said about your businesses, you didn't build that, he was absolutely true. We don't want to admit it, but it is. But nobody in America owns their business. The minute you have to file for a permit, you admit that the government owns control of your business, and control is ownership. And we should know that by now. The minute the government can say, do what we say or we'll pull your permit, you know who owns your business. And when you comply, you now admit you are an indentured servant and not a business owner. And all that could have been avoided if we'd just been simply teaching a little bit of history. Now, this is amazing. Instead of a verbal agreement with Ethelred, we now have an agreement in writing. The 1100 Charter of Liberties, a promise to the people that will signed and sealed by the king, that will bind every king in the future. And they're going to need this promise because in 100 years, they're going to have the most evil king they'll ever know. His name is John. John is a massive taxation king. And if you cannot afford your taxes in John's kingdom, which is highly likely, You're going to be arrested, thrown into prison. John is ordering the mutilation of people who cannot pay their taxes, cutting off hands, feet, ears, cutting the tongues out of people, even executing you if you cannot pay your taxes. There's a bishop writing about John in his day, actually says that even hell will be fouled by the presence of John. Vicious and ruthless, they say he was. You guys know John, by the way. You probably don't realize it. How many of you know this guy? John is the king in the Robin Hood stories. Raise your hand if someone in your life taught you that Robin Hood robs from the rich to give to the poor. That is a lie. Robin Hood was not robbing from the rich to give to the poor in an effort to redistribute wealth. Robin Hood was taking from the king and the crown the money that had been stolen from the people through oppressive and unlawful taxation and returning it to the people so they could live. Remember, John is going to execute you if you cannot pay your taxes. Robin Hood is not a socialist under the guise of putting everybody on equal financial footing. Robin Hood is a liberty fighter giving people their lives back. Because the first step to liberty is always a right to life. Well, if you have to pay the government to live, what kind of person does that make you? But catch this human nature thing. Murdering people for not paying their taxes was not enough to bring the people to point of rebellion. Because you see, John had good advisors, or a wise man himself. Well, he had good advisors. John was not wise. He knew that all they had to do was trickle down just enough stuff to keep the people comfortable, complacent, and compliant. So they valued their comfort more than any struggle for their liberty. And then you can do just about anything to the people, and the people will not push back to keep their comfort. The good news is this, though, because the human nature works in our advantage sometimes, too. People like John always get power drunk. And they start thinking they can do absolutely anything, and the people will never push back. And then they do what I call this fundamental error. That one thing that makes the people go, whoa, wait a minute. And in this case, imagine that. John's offense is he sticks his fingers in the church. He starts trying to do what William did by changing out the leadership of the church to force compliance on the people through the pulpit. But something's different now. What's different? The difference is they're not working on a verbal agreement with the king. The agreement is now in writing. And the very first promise of the 1100 Charter of Liberties, promise number 1, is that the church will be completely free from government intrusion. A king in 1100 knew that if the government is influencing, not just controlling, but even the slightest of influence of the government on the church, you have on notice a wicked, evil government. If your government is telling your churches when, where, and how they can meet, what they can read, what they can sing, how they meet together, when they meet together, you have an evil and oppressive government. And the people of 1100 knew they were righteously justified to resist that government. See, that's where we get our principle of separation of church and state. This is not an invention. Thomas Jefferson didn't coin any principles. Thomas Jefferson, in his letter to the Danbury Baptists, was speaking about their shared English history. Because you see, separation of church and state for centuries has always meant that the government has no business in your church. It's only been since our most recent bout of education into ignorance that the people have been deceived into believing that separation of church and state means that God has no business in conversation. That morality has no business in legislation. That is a wicked, evil lie from the pits of hell. Come on, now you start demanding your legislators leave their morals outside when they make the laws, and you know what kind of government you're going to get. This is not about theocracy. I don't want the spokesman's review out there to start publishing. KrisAnne taught that America needs to be a theocracy. No, because theocracies in the hands of men are always tyranny. Being moral is not the same as believing that the church should rule over the people. As a matter of fact, our history proves that church and government are wicked together. So the people rebel against John, which brings us the second document in the history of our Constitution, the Magna Carta. And now something big has really happened. And you get your next pop quiz. This time, go ahead, answer out loud if you remember. You know, everybody knows the answer. I just taught you. Who gave us the 1100 Charter of Liberties? Henry I, the king. The Magna Carta is not the product of John. The Magna Carta is not a promise from John to the people. It is a demand by the people upon the crown. The Magna Carta is the people standing up to the king and saying, hey, you made us a promise in 1100 that the government would never be evil and oppressive again. You obviously have no idea how to keep your promises. So we, the people, are going to rise in our majesty. We're going to place ourselves above the king. We're going to create a committee of 25 men called the Royal Council who will have the authority to stand in the king's court, poke their finger in the king's face and say, no, you can't do that because it violates our rights. And then we're going to write down in this document that you will sign or lose your head, that we have the rights, that we have the right to resist you, we have the right to rebel against you, we have the right to demand due process, we have the right to demand property rights, we have the right to demand that we be heard. And we have the right as a people to enforce that on you. Our first, fourth, fifth, sixth, seventh, and eighth amendments in our Bill of Rights all come from the Magna Carta. Due process, property rights, not inventions of our founders, but lessons of experience and history. You see, we talked about those 5 liberties of the First Amendment. From the Magna Carta, Clause 61 is where we get the last part, the right of the people to petition the government for a redress of grievances. Not an invention and inheritance. Our First Amendment, just to remind you, you can check yourself, freedom of religion, freedom of speech, freedom of press, the right to peaceably assemble, and the right to petition the government for a redress of a grievance. Not an invention. the recognition of inherent, inalienable rights. Now, John signs the Magna Carta because he's got a sword at his throat. And the people will remove him from the throne less than a year later. But now we have a promise from the king and a demand from the people, all in writing. So we get to skip over 400 years of history to come to this king, Charles I. And history tells us that Charles I is a young, handsome king and quite a party animal. They say Charles loves to romp about Europe, spending on his every whim and fancy. Whose money is Charles spending? How does he get our money? Taxes. Well, remember the royal council created by the Magna Carta? That royal council in 1625 is now called Parliament. And Parliament gets sick and tired of Charles' wasteful spending. And they stand up to Charles and they say, hey, Charles, we are not passing any more of your laws until you get your spending under control. What a novel idea. We got a legislative branch telling the executive branch, we're going to defund you until you get a proper budget. It's great. I mean, we actually have separation of powers in 1625, but we still have a lingering problem. We have a king. And Charles says, hey, you know, those demands you're making on me sure do look good on paper, but let us remember, I'm king, and I'm not even quite sure why I even need a parliament. And he dissolves Parliament. Now, he didn't have to order the sergeant at arms to come take Parliament into custody and throw them out of the court. No, he could have just simply come to the people and said, you know, as king, I have an obligation, a responsibility, a duty to provide you with certain services and securities. You realize to provide you with those securities and services, that takes money. Now, it's really unfortunate that Parliament wants to deprive you of what you're entitled to. And that's wrong. Bad, bad Parliament. So here's the promise that I make to you. If Parliament will not provide for your security, for your services, I will. If they won't legislate, I'm just going to regulate to make it happen. If they won't pass laws, I will. After all, I have a quill and a messenger. Now, I understand that to issue a decree, which I have the legal authority to do, you see, to collect your money could be viewed as a violation of your Magna Carta, taxation without representation. But I promise you, I am not violating your rights because this decree to collect your money is not a tax. You see, it's a loan. Yeah. According to my decree, you have to pay me. No, make no mistake, you have to do it. In order for me to provide you with these services and securities that you're entitled to, you have to pay me the money that I decree. But don't worry, I promise I'll pay you back later. What do we have? We have separation of powers, violations. We have taxation without representation. And guess what happens? 5 knights stand up to Charles and say, whoa, wait a minute. Tax, mandate. We don't care what you call this. This is a violation of our rights. We're not enforcing this law. We're not collecting your tax. We're not even going to pay it ourselves. Charles arrests these 5 knights, throws them into prison, denies them their right to due process by declaring that they are such a danger to society that they don't deserve to have a day in court. A rebellion erupts against Charles, bringing us the 3rd document in the history of our Constitution, the Petition of Right of 1628. Now, one of the things that drives me in learning is my imagination gets away with me, and I often think, you know, what if Charles had had a little bit of modern wisdom? Could he have avoided the whole rebellion and just gone on with status quo? I mean, seriously, if instead of calling his decree a forced loan, could he have avoided the whole rebellion thing if instead he had called it Social Security? Isn't that what Social Security is? The government says you have to pay them by the force of law, and they promise that they'll pay you back later. I mean, a little name change worked in America for generations. Why wouldn't it work for them? I don't know, just a little fun with history for you. Charles signs the Petition of Right the same way John did, with a sword at his throat. But here's the thing. They don't remove Charles from the throne. They let Charles stay king. Maybe they thought Charles learned a lesson. What do you think? Well, he actually learned a lesson, just not the one the people wanted him to learn. See, Charles learned that if I'm going to collect and spend the people's money, I can't just let them see me whim and fancying it. I have to give them an excuse so they want to give me their money. And what's interesting, the years between 1628 and 1641 provide Charles with the perfect excuse. These years are very violent times in Europe. Wars everywhere. And Charles is able to look out to his people and say, hey, you back there, do you guys want those wars our friends are fighting to come here to our land? Do you? Of course not. I have the perfect plan to keep those wars from coming to our kingdom. You see, all you have to do is give me your tax dollars, and I'll make sure all our allies are adequately funded in their wars. And when they're funded, they'll be superior in power and strength, and they will win their wars over there. And when they win their wars over there, what does that mean to us? Peace. Because the wars can't come here if they're ended over there. You see, it's just a matter of national security that you pay your taxes. But 1628 was a big year, and the people are watching Charles very closely. And they're noticing Charles is lying to them. You see, Charles is not funding their allies. He's actually funding their enemies. Because the enemies have made a deal with Charles that the allies wouldn't make. I help you win your wars over there. You come over here and help me get my people back under subjection. Charles is brought up on charges of treason, found guilty, and sentenced to death. A process that brings us the 4th document in the history of our Constitution, the Grand Remonstrance of 1641. A list of grievances against Charles on how he's violated the Petition of Right, the Magna Carta, and the 1100 Charter of Liberties. This document begins like this. The root of all this mischief we find to be a malignant and pernicious design to subvert the fundamental laws and liberties of our kingdom. Now, if we sort of bring that up to 2021 English, what they're really saying is, we've been watching government now for about 600 years, and we're beginning to notice a pattern. The same bag of tricks over and over again, whose only purpose is to overturn and undermine our rights to increase the power of government. And when you read this list of grievances against the king, you see that design. Are you ready? Corruption of the court system, infiltration of foreign law, diminishing the property rights of the people, taking control of the church, creating fiat money to manipulate people through the monetary system, and disarming the people while the government remained armed. And those who do not know their history are doomed to repeat its mistakes. Are you guys familiar with sustainable development? Agenda 20, 30, 40, 60, whatever they're calling it these days. How many of you have heard about that? Right? Do you realize that the UN and UNESCO did not invent sustainable development? Go read the Grand Remonstrance of 1641, and you will find that amongst the grievances against Charles was that he was taking the land from the private landowners for the purpose of resource preservation, and I quote, depopulation. They also accused him of creating fiat money by taking them off the gold and silver standard and creating brass fiat. And for that they said he was committing treason, and they chopped off his head. Now, before you get too excited, we have 4 declarations now in writing of the rights of the people and the limited defined power of the king, but we still have a king. Now, James II is the son of Charles I, and he is king. And he is a great king, a magnanimous king, the best king England has ever had. Just ask him. I am the best king you've ever had. I'm going to give you something you've never had before. Through my power of decree, I am going to give you religious liberty. And then you will know I am the greatest king you've ever had. You see, by my decree, the Declaration of Indulgence, I am going to establish by law that you never have to be a member of the Church of England. You can have church anywhere you want, anytime you want, with any pastor you want, preach anything you want. See, I'm great. On one condition, though. You had to know, right? Before you have church, you must inform the king where you'll be meeting, who will be preaching, what will be said, and you must promise that you will never say anything bad about the king in church. Does that sound like religious liberty? But does it sound like a 501c3? Well, you learned from my bio that I actually practiced First Amendment law. And if your church has been deceived into believing they need a permission slip from the IRS in the form of a 501c3, I've helped people deal with that. And I know precisely the 501c3 application makes your church tell the IRS where they'll be meeting, who will be preaching, And if the IRS questions whether you're actually a religious institution or not, you will have to provide proof of what you'll be teaching. And most people in American churches today, to include the leadership, believe that a 501c3 means that you can't talk about government from behind the pulpit. Your church does not need a 501c3 to be a church. That is a brand new invention in the history of America. Your church does not need to be a 501c3 for its donations to be tax deductible. You are a church. You are not governed by the IRS that way. And even if you are, there is nothing in the law that says you can't talk about government from the pulpit. That is a lie. To keep the most powerful influence in America silent. There is no more powerful control on government for the rights of the people than an educated, active body of Christ. And they know that, which is why the first place they went after during the lockdowns was your church. James arrests 7 bishops who in 1688 stood up to the king and said, "We have a promise over 500 years old that you have no business in our church. We're going to say what we want, when we want, how we want, and we're not following your decree." James realized that he had to give them their day in court or he would lose his head like his father, and each one of those 7 bishops were acquitted. Which is an amazing story in and of itself. A rebellion comes against James called the Glorious Revolution of 1688, bringing us the 5th and final document in the history of our Constitution, the English Bill of Rights of 1689. This English Bill of Rights of 1689 begins by reading, "The late King James II, by the assistance of evil judges, counselors, and ministers employed by him, did endeavor to subvert and extirpate the laws and liberties of our kingdom." They said that what James was doing in their list of grievances was completely destroying liberty. Now, we're not going to go over the list. We're going to go over one, because I want to show you the lessons we should be learning from history. How many of you see the history we've just studied repeating today? Just a little bit? Just generally? Well, let's look at one more. They said James was completely destroying liberty by writing law, the executive, writing law, overturning law, and setting aside law properly legislated was the complete destruction of liberty. This violation of separation of powers. In 1688, a people with no CNN, no MSNBC, no Fox News, no ANN, no Newsmax knew that executive orders would always be the complete destruction of liberty. How did they know? And yet today, our Congress says nothing. Our states do nothing. And our people argue in favor of compliance. Could it be because we have been teaching the wrong things for a very long time? You see, George III did not invent tyranny, and Thomas Jefferson did not invent liberty. the men and women who built our constitutional republic knew that we had to know history to not repeat its mistakes. How different would America be today? How different would Washington be today if we had been teaching this history for the last 75 years? How different has your line of thinking been impacted hearing this history? Can you already think of things that you want to do differently now than in the past? Things that you should expect from your government that you haven't been expecting? Things that you've been expecting that you shouldn't be expecting? Because if we're going to fix this, not for ourselves, but for future generations, these self-evident truths must be owned by us. We must be willing, as our founders were, to pledge life, fortune, and sacred honor to make sure that our children break free from kingdom mentality. We created a documentary. How many of you saw the documentary last night? Great. Well, I'm going to show you a trailer for those of you who did not see it last night to show you the most powerful tool we have to correct the course we're on. Can you turn it up a little bit?
We hold these truths to be self-evident. That all men are created equal and endowed by their Creator with certain inalienable rights. We have a power. And we raise a spoiled, brat, representative government that needs to be taken to the woodshed. Are you satisfied with the government that owns you? There are churches who refuse to allow us to use their facilities to teach.
Unspoken or even sometimes spoken rule that religion and politics don't mix. You wouldn't dare speak out against the government or somehow resist.
Christians have to be involved in politics. God commands it.
Every turn of event through history hinged
One person will stand up,
upon a single person.
and then everybody else will stand.
A gym member, surrounded by a crowd of supporters, was placed in handcuffs.
A Tampa Bay pastor has been arrested, sentenced to a week in jail.
Also tore up a cease and desist letter.
We have a posterity waiting for us to say, we will not comply, so you will be free. We have a chance to fight without bloodshed. But every time we comply, we establish a future where our children will not have that option.
Noncompliantmovie.com. This is a nonprofit movie, so we offer to you at no cost. If you want to partner with us and help pay off this movie, if you want to partner with us because we've started Noncompliant too, you can go to noncompliant.com and make your tax-deductible donation there to help with the funding of this films. We also have a ministry that's a legal ministry, and I wanted to announce to you that on Monday, this Monday, November 22nd at 8 p.m. Eastern Standard Time, 5 p.m. your time, I will be giving a webinar, Religious Exemptions in the Workplace. This is the second one we're doing. The first one was so popular, people were asking us to do it again because they couldn't see it. If you cannot be there at 5 p.m., all you have to do is register and then you can watch it later. But you have to register. Now, you register by going to KrisAnneHall.com. KrisAnnehall.com. KrisAnneHall.com is how you register for this webinar. How many of you believe, I'll announce it again later in case you don't get it. How many of you believe that you need to learn more about American history and our government now? We have an online program, libertyfirstsociety.com. If you text the word liberty to 55444 and follow its instructions, we will get you started on your journey in understanding American history, proper application of the Constitution, and the defense of liberty for our future generations. We are not drive-by teachers. We want to help disciple you. Join us on our podcast. Join us at libertyfirstsociety.com, KrisAnneHall.com, and we will help you continue your education for the defense of liberty of our future. Did you learn something today? So we started a little bit late. We're running a little bit behind. Here's what I'd like for us to do. If that's all right with the pastor and the MC, we'll take a 10-minute break. And when we come back, my husband will be teaching you why God commands you to not follow government that's disobeying the Constitution. We have books and stuff outside. If you have any questions, we'll be out there as well. Thank you so much. Be back here in 10 minutes. I was a platoon leader. I will issue orders.